Hello, everyone. This week's lecture deals with something that I feel is very underlooked in the art world, particularly when learning drawing. But I also think it's one of the most important things to learn, and that is composition. With composition, there are a number of rules for creating an arrangement of objects, or even your landscape, or even a portrait that looks the most successful. And today we're going to go through a lot of those rules and also go over a few mistakes that everyone tends to make when they are creating their compositions. So the biggest thing with creating a successful composition is you should have a strong focal point. The focal point is the area of focus in your artwork. Generally, you'll start by picking just one, and then you might have some kind of sub-focal points in there as well. But really, you want your eye to have one place to start. And obviously, in regards to this piece, it's pretty obvious. It's this large figure here. If you were in a classroom, I'd have us all figure this out together, but I'm going to go through a few ways that they have made this figure into the focal point. One of the key ways, and this was very popular in Mesopotamian art and in Egyptian art, is they just made the figure significantly larger than all of the other ones. Generally, your eye will always go towards larger shapes. Another thing that they did is they put the focal point in front of a bunch of negative space. So he really stands out. Down here, all these figures are walking up towards the mountaintop, but he is the one with the largest backdrop. Another really interesting thing that they do in this victory stele is they also use the figure's gazes to kind of direct our eye up to this focal point. If you look at every single one of the figures, they are all looking up towards the top, kind of telling us if our eyes stray from the focal point, they remind us to go and look back up here. So that's one of the ways that are a few of the ways that they've created strong focal points. And today we're going to go through a few more. Like I mentioned before, the largest form tends to have the most visual weight, and so your eye will tend to go towards the largest object in your composition. Similarly, if you have a super large object and it seems like that object is really holding your gaze a little bit more than it should, you can make those smaller objects a little bit more complex, and that will kind of balance it out. Also, placing forms closer to the edge will give it more visual weight. Also, if you don't want a very boring composition, don't put something directly in the middle because it tends to be the most boring way that you can compose a picture. If you're just doing a study, it doesn't really matter. But if you want to make a successful finished drawing, consider how you're placing your objects on the page, and definitely don't put them right in the middle because it tends to just not do much for your eye. This one is interesting because it has a lot of interesting shapes that it forms, and all of those shapes are different. If you had just placed this right in the center, everything would have been uniform and it wouldn't have been particularly interesting to look at. Complex forms, like I mentioned before, they tend to hold more visual weight as well. This is a time-honored tradition in particularly Chinese art. They love to use a lot of negative space with more complex forms in the foreground or closest to the viewer to make things seem more interesting and also to draw our eye in. Another great rule, and you might notice that it fits in this piece as well, is the rule of thirds. This one is a wonderful way to check your composition, to make sure that your visual information, and in particular your focal point, is in the most interesting part of your page. So all you do is you will draw two lines vertically, and they will be equidistant across the page or across your bounding box, and then similarly horizontally across the page. So basically you're breaking your your image into thirds, and then the intersection of those lines is where your focal point and where most of your visual information should be. Obviously, you do not want them at every single one of these points, because then it'll again be too balanced and it won't look very interesting, or it'll seem very busy. But you definitely want them in at least one or two spots. This is a great example here. They drew the rule of thirds on their painting, and then they decided that most of their visual information would be in this lower left-hand corner. There's a few ways that they create a very successful composition here. Obviously, the largest object in the painting is right on that lower left intersection. And then pretty much all along the vertical line here is where most of their really intense visual information is. Also, though, if you really start to dissect this painting, all of the contrast, all of your lightest lights and darkest darks, particularly the darkest darks, are right in this closest sailboat. And then also over here, they did something really interesting. They are overlapping the sailboats as they move away from us. I apologize for the dog noises. I cannot get them to stop today. But also they are, come on guys, they are decreasing the contrast as the ships move further away from us. Basically, if you are standing on a high spot and you look at the if you're creating a landscape, you will notice, or if you're looking at a landscape, you'll notice that the things furthest away from you tend to have the least amount of contrast, and so that's why they've done that here as well. Even in the water, everything kind of goes into the mid-range as far as the value scale goes, even with color. There are a bunch of ways to create your focal point. Your focal point doesn't always have to have all of the contrast. Instead, like in this piece by Gustave Doré, who's one of my favorite illustrators, this is from his Dante's Inferno series, instead of putting all of the contrast in these two figures, he decided to surround the figures with the most contrast, and it works very effectively. Another thing that he did is he broke this composition up with a series of triangles. So you've got this beautiful sweeping triangle that is being intersected with the two vertical figures, and then this other beautiful triangle here, and of course that gorgeous highlight right behind the two focal point figures really draws your eye in. And then of course the darkest dark is along here as well. But then even the figures, obviously they get smaller, but the contrast also decreases very, very, very quickly as they move away from us. Same with the rock forms back here. So this is a great example of a perfect composition, in my opinion. Obviously, art's subjective, but this is about as successful and clever as you can get. I think a lot of people agree with me on that one, though. So like I mentioned before, Chinese landscapes love to use negative space. They are also really great to look at for reference with strong composition. In some ways, their whole philosophy around landscapes was really pinned on composition entirely. They're very into, the feng shui kind of idea, and their paintings really adhere to that as well. So there's three balanced components to creating these Shanshu Chinese landscapes, and one is the path, which would be here. And it's really all the path is how you kind of enter as the viewer, how you enter this landscape. And then there'll be the threshold, which is kind of a similar idea, but in a much more intimate way. And then the heart, of course, is the focal point. So in this one, again, you can see that a lot of the darks and lights right around this little waterfall that you discover as you look at this piece. That would be the heart and the focal point, but you have to kind of search for it. They don't make it quite as obvious as the Doré piece does. They want you to sit, and the artist wants you to sit and spend quite a bit of time searching this piece and almost kind of hiking the landscape with your eyes before kind of happening upon the heart of this. These are some other examples. Beautiful negative space in both of these. Also creating a really nice narrative with the gaze of the figure in both of these. And then, of course, all of these rules of composition, if you decide you never want to draw again, but you still create art in another way, all of these rules of composition really can adhere to any art form. People tend to follow them even if they're doing sculpture or architecture or video work or movies, all of that, set design. The really successful visual compositions in all of those things, they do tend to adhere to all of these rules. So this is a great example. This artist decided to take the Shanshu principles, and instead of making a painting about it or an ink drawing, they decided to create a photographic series actually, based on that. And I can see that it's pretty successful here. It's very difficult at first when you first glance at it to tell that it is a photograph just because it adheres so well to all of the things seen in the earlier ones. So I wanted to highlight a few artists that really exemplify some of the rules with composition. And one of the first ones I wanted to talk about was Marjane Satrapi. She did a series of graphic novels. It was 2 graphic novels called Persepolis, and it was about growing up as a little girl during the regime change and the political change in Iran, and it's pretty amazing. But she is very conscientious about how she is arranging even her smallest panels. She really considers how the viewer is going to, even just glancing over at how they're going to react to it and where their eye is going to go. So on this one, she's using perfect symmetry, which is very hard to do in an interesting way, but she has made this very successful. Part of it is the fantastic use of line. And also this kind of hugging contour of this figure up here. And then you have a lot of light and dark patterns recurring throughout this piece that really make it immensely successful. In this one, of course, you have your large shape in the foreground where your eye first goes, but it's balanced by this group of more complex, smaller shapes. And so your eye tends to go back and forth, especially since they're looking at each other. So this is another really great example of very stark contrast as well. She is just using black and white. It's very graphic, but very successful. And then here's another couple of ways that you can create different dynamics. Obviously, this is much more simplified. If you want to convey a single focal point, having them be the lightest or darkest part of your page is a great way to do that. And then surrounding it with contrasting elements is kind of how you really push that figure forward, kind of like she did here with the white. However, if you want to convey a sense of gathering or of energy, generally filling the page, especially with something like pattern, is a great way to convey much more movement and much more frivolity or energy. Even with war, if that was in here, that would also be a great way to convey the energy that comes with that. So kind of think about what you want to convey when you're creating your artwork as well. If you want it to be more simplified and quiet, then a composition like the one on the left is probably more what you would want to go with. Whereas if you want to convey a party, or if you want people to feel agitated or angry, any of those very active reactions and emotions, then a composition like this would probably be much more successful, filling the space with information, because it gives your brain a lot more to process. So like I mentioned before, symmetrical balance is a difficult but sometimes successful way of creating your compositions. They were very popular during the Renaissance because it tended to focus on humanity and on humanistic endeavors. and a lot of geometry. Geometry was immensely popular during the Renaissance and kind of the reemergence of the Greek ideals. This is M.C. Escher's work. He did a large series known as the Tessellations. Obviously, this is very perfect symmetry, and it's also a really great example of what your eye does with very simple, perfect contrast, because your eye can't settle on one or the other. These are also interesting because there's not really a constant focal point. Your focal point changes based on what you look at in the image. If you're looking at the white Pegasus, like in the one on the right, all of the orange Pegasus, they tend to fall backwards and almost disappear for a moment until you go and look at the orange figure. Same with over here with the birds. When you're looking at the gray birds, the orange birds fall backwards and become more like negative space or background space. But then when you look at the orange ones, then they come forward and the gray falls backwards. So he really liked to mess around with focal points and how the eye perceives two-dimensional work like that and how he could really mess with it. And then Diego Rivera was also a very successful person with perfect symmetry. A lot of his work involved these sort of bisected, mirrored, symmetrical figures, especially, and then of course that basket of calla lilies up top really kind of pins down the composition in a really beautiful way. Another thing that he did here, obviously this center figure with the calla lilies is perfectly symmetrical, but then he knew that he needed to balance out these two figures, and he did that with integrating, obviously this is slightly more complex because of the two heads here, but he compensated for that over here with the circle of braids. So they really balance each other out in an interesting way. Asymmetrical balance is how most people tend to create compositions. It's a lot easier as far as creating something that's a little bit more interesting. This is part of Hiroshige's woodcut series about the waves. If any of you have seen The Great Wave, which I think most of you have, this is also the same artist. In this one, he is again kind of breaking this up into more simplified shapes. You kind of have this really gorgeous triangular shape right towards the middle with the ground here. And then you have the larger boat, which is almost coming directly at us. And then to give a sense of depth, he has the smaller one, and it seems like it's much further away, along with the lightning water as it moves towards the top of the composition. So this is a very active composition in that it kind of gives us that sense of how the people in the boat would feel moving through the water and feeling the sea spray on them. This is by Paul Gauguin. This is also an asymmetrical composition. When you first look at it, it almost seems symmetrical because of how well balanced he's created this painting. So this figure is not perfectly centered, and that was a very clever choice in his composition because he decided to make more figures on the right, and if he had placed this figure in the center, it wouldn't have actually seemed like a very balanced composition. There's a lot more space over on the left, and that's kind of what balances out the busyness on the right. He also has these really nice little triangular caps on either corner, upper corner, that kind of reins in the whole composition. And you really only get that shock of super bright yellow in right around that vertical figure and also the figure behind it, and then in those corners as well. So it really moves your eye around in a very lovely way. Another thing that he did here is he has that perfectly vertical figure, and then he has another one a little bit in the background, that gray statue. But then he also has a lot of horizontal elements, like this horizon line, and then of course the mountain that is cut off, it's cropped out. But then even the little hillscape, everything in there is very horizontal, and that also balances out all the verticality of some of those figures. So one artist that I really love to talk about every quarter is El Cid. His work is immensely symmetrical, but very, very dynamic and very interesting to look at, and very large, as you can see here. He is a Parisian and Tunisian artist. He likes to call himself a calligraphitist. He started out doing graffiti, but people really loved his work and they started hiring him to do murals. So he is Muslim, and he has a tradition in Muslim calligraphy. He decided to master it at a very young age, and he started to integrate it into his artwork, and then eventually it ended up just becoming all of his artwork. And he uses it to kind of represent who he is as a person. When he moved from Tunisia to Paris, he kind of felt a culture shock that he thought was very exciting, actually. And he really wanted to embrace the Parisian lifestyle while also maintaining a lot of his more traditional aspects in his life. And so he started to do these Islamic calligraphy patterns, but he would start by writing more Western phrases in Islamic calligraphy, and then kind of rearranging it into these symmetrical murals, kind of to represent his the integration of his personality in places like Tunisia and Paris and elsewhere. So subordination is a really great technique for including a lot of visual information, but not overwhelming your viewer. So in this one, obviously your eye, the first place it goes is to this large white dot on the right side of the poster. And then you also have a lot of light points back here. You know, both of these figures are backlit a little bit with this crazy kind of Jedi glow. But they also wanted to include the Death Star and all of the fighters and, of course, Darth Vader. And so they're using subordination in this. They started with the focal point and then built everything up around that. And obviously your contrast is less in the Darth Vader mask and in the Death Star. And, you know, these are much smaller. And they're also coming out, as far as lines go, the lines are very repetitive. So you have the triangle of the two front figures, and then you've got the little droids that are sort of completing that triangle. And then you have the triangle of Darth Vader's mask. And then you have another little triangle over here of the fighters. So there's a lot of recurring shapes throughout this poster. But of course, the big thing is kind of pushing things back so that your eye can take them in later after the focal point. You don't want your eye to be trying to take in everything at once, because then it'll just seem very disorganized and difficult to look at. Directional forces are another great way to do this, which again you'll do with subordination, with highlights, and with darks. So these are both by the artist from the Baroque period. Her name is Artemisia Gentileschi. And she did a series of biblical paintings. These are both the same topic, Judith and Holofernes. And this is her little handmaiden over here in both of them. And there are some really interesting shapes. And your eye keeps moving around in both of them. And it's because of all of the highlights throughout this painting. And your eye really kind of just wants to keep going in a circle with these figures. Anytime your eye wants to move away from the painting, something will draw you back in. If you follow her gaze over, then you'll start looking for the lightest point. Your eye will start looking for the lightest point near that, which will be right around here, and then that highlight will drag you back down. Triangles, they're very popular in composition. And of course, that contrast on either side of these figures on the right really highlights them as well. So one of my favorite ways to create something interesting and to create energy in an artwork is the use of pattern. And this is a really easy way to take something that's a little boring and to make it interesting. So this is an installation piece by the Japanese artist Yayoi Kusama. She had a show at the Seattle Art Museum. I think it was in 2018, and it was really great. It was also really hard to get into, but she completely focuses on the use of repetitive pattern to create these infinite spaces through polka dots and then also through a use of mirrors. So this is actually a very small room. The floor is right around here. You know, there's only about 4 or maybe even 5 rows of pumpkins in the whole room. But because it's a completely mirrored room and because she's also using very direct light coming from the pumpkins, it creates this kind of infinite, crazy space. Kehinde Wiley also uses quite a bit of pattern in his work, and there's no reason that you can't use something like this in your own work. As a matter of fact, it would look really gorgeous. So you could take your still life, especially if you thought that it looked kind of boring, and instead of just leaving your background or the ground that the object is sitting on, just leaving it blank or even just making it black or white, you could fill that space with some kind of pattern like this, especially a sort of living pattern, and then you can kind of bring that pattern up to sort of embrace your objects, kind of like he has the figure here, Obama, being sort of embraced and nestled in with all of his background portraits. Same thing in here. I'm actually not going to talk about dynamic symmetry. So if you missed class, on Monday, we did an exercise with composition where we drew a bunch of bounding boxes or frames on our large piece of paper. You can do this in your sketchbook too if you prefer. But when we went to draw the objects, instead of drawing a still life of several objects, people chose a single object and they zoomed into it almost to or past the point of abstraction. So this is a really great exercise for making you truly look at your object. And it also is a really great way to create a very interesting composition because it fully fills up your page. So it's really hard to get something that's boring with this kind of composition because you have so much visual information to take in. It can get a little overwhelming, but usually because you have very similar patterns within a single object, it tends to just look really interesting. So I had people do a set of 4 of these or more, and I would recommend doing the same at home. And then on Wednesday, well, we also talked about pattern a little bit on Monday, but I'm also going to push pattern on Wednesday in class. Working with pattern in your composition. It was very popular for the post-impressionists such as Paul Gauguin and then also Matisse. This is Cézanne. So Cézanne, Gauguin, and Matisse were all really enamored with the use of pattern, especially with portraits and still lives. So you don't necessarily have to, with Kehinde Wiley, where he created this almost abstract background, which is a little flat and then also not at the same time, but it's very much not realistic. If you would prefer to stay realistic, you can just have a patterned cloth or a wallpaper or a patterned backdrop that will look a little bit more realistic if that's kind of what you're going for. There are a number of ways to work with pattern in an engaging way in your still life, and I had a few people practice with that as well. And then another great technique, you have your thumbnail bounding box or frame. You can break that frame and it tends to make really interesting compositions. My biggest recommendation, if you have a very simple composition, here it's just the single tree house. it's only breaking one edge of that bounding box. If you have one or two objects, I would only have them break one or at most two edges of the bounding box, usually adjoining edges. And that tends to make things look a little bit more interesting. However, if you want to draw something a little bit more complex, like this piece on the left, then breaking the bounding box in several places can work quite well as well. Also, your bounding box does not necessarily have to always be rectangular. It can be square, it can be triangular. I've had a lot of students find really beautiful success with triangular bounding boxes and then breaking it towards the top. Obviously, circular bounding boxes works really, really nicely, or oval. So there are a number of shapes that you can create for your bounding box to create really interesting compositions. And they can still be very realistic as well. So just a lot of things to consider. And then next week for our big project, you will have to choose your still life, build your still life, and you can do this with objects from home, or you can do this in class with objects that we have provided for you. And then you will do at least 4 thumbnail sketches, thinking about how many different ways you can draw that still life. And then you will choose your favorite of those 4. And then definitely hold on to those because you will be submitting those with your final project, with your project. And then you'll have 2 days in class to work on your finished still life. And that can either be charcoal or graphite, it's up to you. But it needs to be finished by the following Monday. So if you have any questions about this lecture or you need me to send you some demos, I can do that. I'm also going to be uploading a few student examples in the module kind of subheading that you can use as inspiration. And I will be checking my email constantly. So if you need any reference or help, let me know. Great.